Before we begin with the 4 cases in today's video, I want to take a moment to thank you all for your incredible support throughout 2024. A special thanks goes out to channel members whose names are listed here. Your positive comments, ongoing engagement, and generous contributions are truly appreciated. It's because so many of you continue to watch, comment, and share these videos that the channel continues to grow, and I thank you all for your contribution to Briefcase. Today I'll be looking at 4 cases. One that I recorded in 2020, one that I recorded in 2021, one from 2022, and one from 2023. As many of you comment that my narration style has changed, and also the way I put together the videos, so any comments telling me which ones you prefer would be very much appreciated. The first video I recorded in 2020, and is from 19th century Sweden. Anna Mansdotter was born on the 28th of December 1841 in a small village near the city of Kristianstad in southern Sweden. Although her family were relatively poor, the area she lived in was very beautiful, close to the river Helge. She received an elementary education, as in 1842 it became law in Sweden for every local government to establish at least one permanent school, and although in the poorer communities, parents often had little interest in sending their children, most received some schooling. When Anna was considered old enough, she went to work. Sweden was starting to change. Previously, the majority of people worked in agriculture, but as the free trade movement started to gain support throughout Europe, the country began to export more copper, iron ore, and timber. The economy grew, and the opportunities for the Swedish people increased. Like many young women at the time who lived in small rural communities, Anna married when she was relatively young and moved to the coastal village of Ingö, situated next to the Baltic Sea. There were only a few hundred inhabitants, and everyone knew each other. Her husband, named Nils Nilsson, was 13 years her senior and owned a farm just outside the village. When Anna married him, she thought that she would be greatly improving her circumstances. But this was not the case. They lived in a very simple house, and Anna assisted her husband with his work on the farm. The nearest town was Aarhus, which was 7 kilometers away. Over the next few years, Anna gave birth to 3 children, but tragically only one survived into adulthood. Although the improvements in medicine had seen the infant mortality rate decline, it was higher in the poorer communities where Anna and Niels lived. As time passed, their farm started to decline. Life in Sweden was changing. Before 1850, 90% of people lived in the countryside. But after the first railways were opened, a period of industrialisation started, and people started to migrate to the larger cities, where new opportunities for work emerged. Things for the family got worse when Nils became ill and was unable to work. In 1883, he died. Anna was now in her early 40s and a widow. Her son Per was 21 and started to take on the responsibility of managing the farm. As they got on with working and trying to improve their finances, rumours started to spread throughout the village that Anna and Per did not live in the house as mother and son. Instead, the two were engaged in an incestuous relationship. Of course, this was always denied by Anna. She decided the best way to stop all the local gossip was for her son to find a wife, and arranged that he marry a pretty young lady from the nearby village of Brösarp. Her name was Hanna Johansdotter. This seemed like a very good bride for Per, as Hanna was not only charming and intelligent, she was also the daughter of a very well-regarded gentleman named Johan Olsson, who was the local district judge. He and his wife, Hanna Andersson, were both well-respected members of the community. The couple married in 1887, and it was agreed that after the wedding, Hanna should move into the farmhouse with Per, and Anna would go and live with her mother. Anna, however, seemed to be in no hurry to leave. She was quite contented just living in the farmhouse with her son and his wife. But Hanna found her to be a difficult woman, and the relationship between the two ladies started to deteriorate. Although Hanna was happy with her choice of husband, she resented the interference from her mother-in-law. She found that Anna was not at all approachable and even though she discussed her feelings with Per, he never wanted to cross his mother and seemed to be totally under her control. She wrote to her father and asked if he could help, and although he was sympathetic to his daughter's concerns, there was very little he could do if Anna refused to leave. The situation did not improve, and it became apparent that the two ladies did not get on at all well. Rather than being happy for her son, Anna seemed to be jealous of his young, attractive wife. Hannah again wrote to her parents to tell them how unhappy the situation was making her. She advised them that she could not continue to live in these circumstances and explained that she had asked Per if they could leave the farm and set up home elsewhere. On the 28th of March 1889, a neighbour came to the house to inquire about Hannah. It was a nice spring morning, but she was nowhere to be seen. The neighbour asked Per where his wife had gone. His answer was vague, and he just said that she had gone out. The neighbour considered this a somewhat strange reply, and asked if she had gone far, and should they both not go and look for her. Per didn't seem particularly concerned, but they decided to look for Hannah. After only a few moments, they noticed that the trapdoor of the basement of the house was open, so Per went down the stairs. He could see that there was something there. It was dark, but with the light from the candle, he discovered his wife lying on the floor. He looked closer and realised that she was dead. The neighbour was shocked at the sight of the pretty young lady's lifeless body lying on the floor of the basement stairs, but Per did not seem to show any emotion. The neighbour rushed to get help from other villagers, and together they moved the body from the basement to the bedroom. They also summoned the local priest. At first it was presumed that Hannah must have fallen down the basement stairs to her death, but as the people who had gathered around the bed looked more closely, they noticed that there were bruises and marks on her neck, and although she was fully clothed, she was not wearing her corsage. This was a sleeveless article of clothing that covered the body from the neck to the waist, and was very common in Europe during the 18th and 19th centuries. No one could ever recall seeing Hannah without one. The police were called, and they immediately suspected that the death looked suspicious and needed further investigation. They arranged for an autopsy to be performed, the results of which concluded that the cause of Hannah Johansdottir's death was strangulation. The police arrested both Per and Anna and interviewed them about the circumstances surrounding the death of Hannah. At first, both said that the poor woman must have fallen down the basement stairs. The basement was a dark place, and Hannah would often have to go there. The autopsy, however, had come to a very different conclusion, and the police continued to interrogate mother and son. Eventually, Per confessed to the murder of his wife. The police, however, had considered that Anna was probably the instigator of the terrible crime. She seemed unconcerned about Hannah's death and had been unexpressive throughout her interrogation. They believed that she controlled her son, and even if she had not committed the actual crime, she had certainly been the one who had orchestrated it. Neighbours told them that Hannah was very unhappy at the way her mother-in-law treated her, and that Anna seemed to be very jealous of Per's young, attractive wife. They told the police about the local gossip concerning the improper relationship between Anna and her son. They also informed them how many villagers thought that Per only married Hannah after the rumours had intensified. Hannah's father showed the police the letters from his daughter. Now everyone could see that her words were a cry for help from a desperate young lady needing assistance in resolving her issues with her mother-in-law, who was constantly interfering with her marriage. Despite all the efforts of the police, exactly how and where Hannah Johansdottir was murdered was never completely established. Although eventually both mother and son admitted that they had committed the terrible crime, their confessions were not consistent with each other's, and trying to ascertain what was true and what was not was somewhat difficult. They concluded that the most likely explanation was that Hannah had discovered Per and Anna were conducting an improper relationship, and in order that she would not be able to speak about it, Anna murdered her. Then, in an attempt to cover it up, they threw her into the basement. It was also believed that Hannah was probably killed at night or in the early hours of the morning, and that Anna had dressed her, and that is why she was found without her corsage. After more than 5 days of interrogation, the police charged both Anna and Per with the murder of Hannah Johansdottir. They were tried at the district court, not only for the murder, but also for having an illegal illicit relationship. Both received prison sentences for the relationship and the death penalty for their part in the killing of the poor defenceless young lady. The sentences were later ratified by the High Court. Their lawyers appealed the sentences. Per's appeal was supported by most of the village. People thought that he was a pleasant young man who had always been controlled by his mother. They believed that she was the person who had instigated the crime and also the one who had strangled Hannah. Per eventually had his sentence reduced to life in prison, which he served in Karlskrona. Anna's case, however, was different. The letters that Hannah had written to her parents had outlined how she had been treated by her mother-in-law, and during the interrogation and the trial, Anna had shown very little emotion and never expressed any regret for the crime. She was also blamed for the illegal relationship with her son. Despite the fact that no woman had been executed in Sweden for over 30 years, the decision was made that Anna's sentence should be carried out, and her execution date was set for the 7th of August 1890. She was taken to the prison in Kristianstad. Prison guards and the prison chaplain encouraged her to show remorse for what she had done, but she would not. She would also not take Holy Communion on the 6th of August, the night before her execution. At 8 a.m. on Thursday the 7th of August 1890, Anna Mansdottir was led into the courtyard of Kristianstad prison, where she was beheaded. She was 48 years old. She was the last woman to be executed in Sweden. Hannah Johansdottir was buried at the Brösarp cemetery. Her parents were buried in the same grave. Per was released from prison in 1913. The previous 23 years, however, had taken their toll on him, and he was not in good health. He eventually died 5 years later in 1918. The second case, recorded in 2021, is from late 19th century Australia. Frances Lydia Alice Thwaites was born on the 6th of November 1867 in Hoxton, which at the time of her birth was a small town close to London in the county of Middlesex. Today, Hoxton is part of the London Borough of Hackney. Although she was christened Frances, this was the same name as her mother, so she was known as Minnie. Her father was William Sutton Thwaites, a respectable gentleman who worked as a hat maker in the elegant area of Chelsea. He provided a nice home for his wife and their 7 children. He would parade them all at church on Sundays. They would always be dressed in nice clothes, and his daughters would be wearing fine bonnets. He was considered to be an honourable gentleman and made sure that all of his children were polite and well-mannered. While the family were not wealthy, they were considered to be of good social standing, and Minnie had a pleasant childhood in comfortable surroundings. The family, however, had their reputation brought into question when rumours started to emerge that Minnie was conducting herself in a very unworthy manner. There were whispers that she was involved in a relationship with a soldier. These were compounded when she disappeared from the family home, only to return days later in a state that was not befitting a young lady. Her parents were most displeased with her behaviour, whether on the assistance of her parents for bringing shame on the family or of her own volition. Minnie decided to emigrate to Australia. During the 1880s, many Europeans migrated to Australia. The economy was booming and there was much available work. She arrived in Sydney, which was a rapidly growing city. Its streets were busy with horse-drawn wagons, trams, and people going about their daily business. It was very different to her life back in Hoxton, with her parents, brothers and sisters. She was still just 19 years old, but realised that she must now work and try to take advantage of any opportunities available. She started by telling people that her name was Frances, as she no longer wanted to be addressed as Minnie. She found work in domestic service. There were many vacancies for maids in 1887. Frances took a position, even though she believed that her education and upbringing would mean that after a while she could find alternative employment. She was a hard and reliable worker, but on her days off, she would spend time in the company of individuals who her parents certainly would not have approved of. It seemed that she had not learned from her previous experiences back in Hoxton. One such gentleman was named Rudolf Knorr. He worked as a waiter and was also known to be a petty criminal and swindler. He, like Francis, had left his homeland to come to Australia, having been born and brought up in Germany. They spent much time together, and on the 2nd of November 1889, they married. As Rudolph's business dealings were often illegal, the couple moved to Melbourne, where in 1892, Francis gave birth to a daughter. At the time, Melbourne was the second largest city in the British Empire and was one of the richest in the world. There were beautiful parks and gardens, which were ideal for taking the baby out in her pram, and the tree-lined boulevards always looked majestic alongside the elegant sandstone buildings. Initially, life in Melbourne was good, but in the early 1890s, the Australian economy fell into a severe depression. Investment from abroad decreased, and there was a significant rise in unemployment. Frances found herself needing the help of relief societies in order to obtain food. Her situation got worse when her husband was sent to prison for selling some of the furniture that he had managed to obtain on credit. She was now in a very poor financial position, and with a young child to support. She was 25 years old, and often approached by gentlemen. One was named Edward Thompson, who worked as a fishmonger's assistant. For a while, Frances lived with Edward, but the relationship did not last very long, and when he left her, she found herself without anywhere to live, and without any means to provide for herself and her daughter. With very few options available, she attempted to make dresses, but with little success. By now in quite a desperate position, she set up her own childcare service. She would agree to look after babies for a weekly or lump sum payment, even though there were licensed homes for women to take their young children. There were not enough for the large number that needed to be cared for. Young unmarried mothers had often sought these types of services so their babies could be adopted and they themselves could return to their families as respectable young ladies. Now, however, with unemployment high and the poor economic situation in the country, some married women who already had young children would also look to put their babies into the hands of the unlicensed childcare providers, asking that they find good parents to adopt their baby. These operations, however, did not always have the child's best interests at heart. The women who provided these services were often referred to as baby farmers, and it was known that in England, Margaret Waters was hanged in 1870, Anna Took in 1879, and in Scotland, Jessie King was hanged in 1889, all for being found to be responsible for the deaths of the babies in their care. The Melbourne press had reported on cases of neglect, cruelty, terrible conditions, and lack of food in these establishments, and mothers were always aware that handing their young children over to these unlicensed care providers did come with some risk. The authorities, however, found it difficult to stop these operations, especially as they were a service that was always required. Frances was articulate and would always give the impression that she was a caring lady who would either find a good couple to adopt an unwanted child or care for the infant herself until their parents were in a position to take the child back. She would use her own daughter as an example as to how well she looked after children. She sometimes made out that she was not her daughter, but an infant who she had been caring for, and would continue to do so until the circumstances of the child's parents improved and they were in a position to collect the little girl. This offered some sort of comfort to the mothers who believed that they had no other choice but leave their babies in the hands of unlicensed care providers. These arrangements, however, were usually not very formal. Frances would use alias names and frequently move from property to property. If a mother wanted to see her baby, she may find that Mrs. Frances Knorr was no longer residing at the address where she had left the child. Most unmarried mothers who found themselves in these circumstances did not report their babies as missing, as they were anxious not to be exposed as someone who had given birth to an illegitimate child. When Rudolf Knorr was released from prison, he and Frances decided to return to live in Sydney. By now, Frances was again pregnant. In September 1893, the new tenant of a house in Moreland Road in the Melbourne suburb of Brunswick was digging his garden when he came across a horrifying discovery: the body of a baby. He contacted the police, who quickly arrived, and an inquiry began. The body was of a baby girl, who was later identified to be Gladys Crichton, and it was estimated that she would have been around 3 weeks old when she had died. Neighbours informed the detectives that the lady who had previously occupied the house had also lived at another property nearby, number 26 Davies Street. The police decided to visit the residence. They dug in the garden and made another macabre discovery: the body of 2 infant boys. The investigating officers now had to find the person who at some stage had occupied both properties. The person's name was Mrs. Frances Knorr. When they tried to trace her, they discovered that she had moved around quite a bit and often used different names each time she acquired a new place to live. However, they were able to establish that her husband had recently been released from prison and that he and his wife had returned to Sydney. Once they had this information, they were soon able to locate the couple. They had rooms in Brisbane Street in the Surrey Hills area of the city. The police had planned to arrest them both. However, Frances was pregnant, and when the detectives arrived at the property on the 4th of September 1893, she went into labour. They had to wait until she had given birth before arresting her. Mr. Rudolph and Mrs. Frances Knorr were then escorted back to Melbourne. An autopsy on the bodies suggested that the baby girl had died from strangulation, while the boys had been suffocated. An inquest was held. Neighbours who had lived in Moreland Road, in the Melbourne suburb of Brunswick, told of the many young women they would see leaving their babies for Mrs. Knorr to look after. Many unmarried mothers, however, were reluctant to give evidence. They certainly did not want their indiscrepancies exposed. It was said that once Frances received a baby, she would sometimes take the child to another child-minding service who charged less money, but with no records of how many infants she had been paid to look after. The authorities had no idea as to how many may have died while in her care. They were also unable to identify the 2 deceased male infants and were only able to confirm that the baby girl was named Gladys Crichton. Following the inquest, Mrs. Frances Knorr was charged with murder. The police also charged her husband, Mr. Rudolph Knorr. The trial began on the 27th of November 1893. The prosecution alleged that Mrs. Knorr was looking after a 3-week-old baby named Gladys Crichton between the 8th and 11th of April, after which the child was not seen again. They outlined that she would regularly move house and was reluctant to let anyone know where she was moving to. The prosecution also produced a number of witnesses, including a young nursemaid, who told of how Mrs. Knorr had once borrowed a spade from a neighbour as she claimed that she wanted to dig the garden. A few days later, the nursemaid said that Mrs. Knorr again moved house. Another piece of evidence presented was a letter that Frances Knorr had written to Mr. Edward Thompson, whom she had lived with for a while her husband was in prison. In the letter, she asked that he tell the authorities the children were his and that they had died of consumption. Mr. Thompson, however, knew that this would in some way implicate himself and handed the letter over to the authorities. He told them that he had no knowledge of any such events. Mrs. Frances Knorr gave a statement from the witness box. She did admit that she had indeed buried the babies in Moreland Road, but claimed that the children had died of natural causes. She said that Gladys had died of convulsions, saying to the court, "She died from convulsions, and not from any ill treatment on my part. I swear that I did everything in my power to resuscitate her. I thought of going to the police first, but got frightened. Then I thought, I will bury her." The prosecution refuted this. They believed that the little girl had been strangled with tape, and the 2 boys had been suffocated. The judge, Mr. Justice Holtroyd, summed up the case and pointed out that there was no direct proof that the defendant, Mrs. Frances Knorr, had committed these acts. At the end of the trial, Mr. Rudolph Knorr was discharged. However, his wife Frances, who had been emotional throughout, was found guilty and sentenced to death. As the sentence was read out, she collapsed. She then had to be assisted out of the court before being transported to prison. The trial had caused great interest and had been very much discussed in Melbourne. Although the majority of the press had always believed her to be guilty and thought that her sentence was just, the public seemed divided, not on whether or not she was guilty, but on whether she should receive the death penalty. Newspapers were inundated with letters from readers who asked that they campaign to get the sentence commuted. Some believed her to be the victim of terrible circumstances. They pointed out that she was unable to get any help from the state and tried to support herself and her daughter by taking in young children. However, she could not cope, and in despair committed these terrible crimes. A petition was raised and presented to the governor, but he refused to overturn the decision. The hangman was named Thomas Jones, and he was very uneasy about having to hang a woman. Although the newspapers had reported the details of her crimes, he knew the difficulties that Frances would have faced trying to bring up a baby alone. Thomas's wife considered that Mrs. Knorr's sentence should be commuted and told her husband about how she felt about what he had been asked to do. There were reports that she had said that if he hanged Mrs. Knorr, she would leave him. It all became too much for Thomas, and he took his own life a few days before the execution. Things took another turn when the day before Mrs. Frances Knorr was due to be hanged, she penned a statement confessing to the crimes. She wrote, "Placed as I am, now within a few hours of my death, I express a strong desire that this statement be made public, with the hope that my fall will not only be a warning to others, but also act as a deterrent to those who are perhaps carrying out the same practice. I now desire to state that on the charges known in evidence as number 1 and number 2 babies, I confess to be guilty." At 10 a.m. on Monday the 15th of January 1894, Frances Knorr walked to the gallows. As she did, many people had gathered outside the prison to sing hymns. She was calm and looked straight ahead. Her last words were, "Yes, the Lord is with me. I do not fear what men may do to me. I have peace, perfect peace." Frances Knorr was then hanged. The third case, recorded in 2022, is from early 20th century USA. Arthur Warren Waite was born on the 2nd of December 1886 in Canonsburg, Kent County, Michigan. He was the youngest child of Warren and Sarah Waite and had 2 brothers and 1 sister. Arthur's parents kept a small farm and also worked on their own vegetable stall. The family did not have very much money, but they worked hard to earn what they could to get by. When Arthur was in primary school, he managed to get a job delivering newspapers. He did well at school and succeeded in sports, especially tennis, where he won a number of local tournaments. After graduating in 1905, he studied to become a dentist and attended the University of Michigan. Here he was a popular student, especially with the young ladies. He had a charming manner and was considered to be very handsome. Arthur, however, was not very truthful while studying in Michigan. He was often caught lying, stealing, and copying work. He was eventually asked to leave the university. But that did not deter him. He doctored records that made it seem like he had completed things that he didn't actually complete, and somehow he managed to secure himself a scholarship to study in Scotland. The course he was enrolled to study was meant to take 2 years, but strangely, Arthur was able to complete it much quicker. He was then given a bonus and received an offer to work as a dentist with a mining company in South Africa. The employment lasted for 2 years, but was eventually terminated after a manager suspected him of stealing when it was discovered that a large amount of money had gone missing. Strangely, the manager died soon after, officially of apoplexy. Arthur then promptly returned to the United States. It was reported that during his time working in the mining company, he had embezzled approximately $7,000. Before Arthur had left for Scotland, he had become acquainted with a lady named Clara Louise Peck. They got along well and continued to correspond during the time that Arthur was overseas. Clara was born on the 9th of December 1887 and was the youngest of 3 children. Sadly, her elder sister died when Clara was just 8 years old. Unlike Arthur, however, growing up, Clara was no stranger to money. Her grandfather had started a family drugstore, and when her father finished his education, he and his brother founded a drug company that they named Peck Brothers. They eventually sold this for a very large sum. Clara's father also worked as the president of the National City Bank and held shares in many companies. By 1915, it was believed he was worth in excess of $1 million. Clara had enjoyed a very privileged education and attended a prestigious private all-girls school in Washington. Now back in the USA, Arthur settled in New York. He told everyone that he had set up a dental practice and had begun to study medicine. The same year, Clara's mother was throwing a social gathering, and Clara invited Arthur to attend. She was very impressed by his achievements and liked to spend time in his company. Clara and Arthur then started courting. Clara had an elder brother called Percy, and he was not so keen on Arthur and did not think that his sister should be with him. However, Mrs. Hannah Peck, Clara's mother, liked him very much, so much so, she encouraged her daughter to marry him. Arthur and Clara continued to go out, and eventually Arthur proposed to her, and of course, she accepted. As a wedding gift, Clara's father, Mr. John Peck, gave them $50,000, a very large sum of money at the time, but the gift was not $50,000 all at once. Instead, the money was to be held in trust, and the couple would only be able to withdraw $300 a month. Just a few weeks before Arthur and Clara's wedding, it was alleged that he proposed to another woman. The woman, knowing that Arthur was already spoken for, sent a letter to Clara, telling her about his proposal and advising her not to marry him. Clara took no notice and married him anyway. The wedding took place at the Fountain Street Baptist Church on the 19th of September 1915. Following this, they moved into a luxurious 7-bedroom apartment on Riverside Drive in Manhattan that Mr. John Peck had purchased for them. While apparently studying medicine at the Cornell Medical School, Arthur would tell people that he was employed in different New York hospitals, and it seemed as though he worked very long hours. When he wasn't working, he would play tennis and impress New York society with his skills on the courts. He was certainly becoming quite well known in the most exclusive New York social circles, and he tried to impress everyone he spoke to. Clara's wealthy Aunt Catherine was so taken by him that she gave him $40,000 and asked him to invest it for her. Just after their first Christmas together, Clara and Arthur invited Clara's mother, Mrs. Hannah Peck, to stay with them in their New York apartment. The apartment was in a very picturesque part of Manhattan, on Riverside Drive, a long tree-lined road with large houses and new apartment buildings that overlooked the Hudson River. The area had been attracting wealthy New York residents since 1904, following the opening of the subway that meant it became possible to commute from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to the business areas of the city. Mrs. Peck arrived on the 10th of January 1916, but strangely, soon started to feel unwell. Although during her visits, Arthur had been very busy, leaving the apartment very early and not returning until late in the evening. When his mother-in-law became ill, he suddenly became very attentive and did his best to look after her. He brought her roses and sat by her bed. However, she did not seem to be getting any better. Instead, her condition was becoming worse. Then on the 30th of January, the previously healthy Mrs. Hannah Peck passed away. Doctors diagnosed the cause of death as kidney disease. Her body was transported to her home in Grand Rapids, and although it was always thought that she would be buried, Arthur said that she had asked to be cremated in order to limit everyone's grief. Mrs. Hannah Peck was 64 years old when she died. Shortly after the death of his wife, Mr. John Peck, now a widower, went to New York to stay with his daughter. He was in very good health when he arrived, but just a little while later, he began to feel unwell. Arthur gave him a throat spray to help with his condition, telling him to use it several times a day. Apparently the illness had begun just a few hours after he had eaten some ice cream, and it gradually got worse. The symptoms he experienced included stomach pain, nausea, and vomiting. Clara and Arthur's maid said that she thought that she had seen Arthur adding something to the broth he prepared for his father-in-law, but when questioned about this, Arthur said that Mr. Peck was a difficult patient and he wouldn't take his medication, so he had to mix it with his food. Clara was becoming increasingly more worried about her father, so contacted a doctor. The doctor visited the apartment daily, but Mr. Peck's condition did not improve. He complained that he was suffering from nausea and said that he was finding it difficult to eat. Clara's father, Mr. John Peck, died on the 12th of March 1916, and his cause of death was reported as heart disease and nephritis. Arthur said that it was John's wish to be cremated in Grand Rapids like his wife. He then arranged to travel there by train along with the body. It was an extremely sad time for Clara, who had now lost both her mother and her father. When she and Arthur arrived at the Grand Rapids station, they were met by Clara's brother Percy. He had never really liked his sister's husband and had become quite suspicious of him. His suspicions had increased as shortly before Arthur and Clara arrived, he had received a telegram from someone named Miss Kay Adams, stating that he should demand an autopsy on his father's body, as Miss Adams believed that Mr. John Peck's death may have been due to something other than illness and old age. Although Percy did not know who Kay Adams was, he took the telegram very seriously. He questioned Arthur as to how both his parents had died while in New York under his care, and in such a short space of time. Arthur did not really have any answers, except that neither had been in very good health. Percy took his father's body into his possession and arranged for a private autopsy to be performed. That evening, Arthur went to the mortuary. He claimed that he had a flower and a picture of Clara that he wanted to put into Mr. Peck's caskets. However, his request was refused, which resulted in Arthur becoming quite distressed. He said that neither he or his wife Clara had requested an autopsy, and that there had been no permission given to conduct one. Clara's brother, however, had not only arranged it, he had become so concerned that he hired someone to guard his father's body right up to the funeral. The autopsy examined Mr. Peck's heart and lungs, and the results did not suggest that his demise had been due to heart or kidney disease, which had been given as the original cause of death. Chloroform was also found in his brain. His stomach was then sent to Dr. Victor C. Vaughan at the medical department at the University of Michigan, who would conduct further examinations. The funeral of Mr. John Peck was held 2 days later and was attended by neither Arthur or Clara. Their reasoning was that Clara was too emotional and that Arthur stayed with his wife to look after her. However, the pair did manage to be in attendance for the reading of the will. Here the attorney informed everyone present that the majority of Mr. Peck's estates would be split equally between his children Clara and Percy. Clara's brother, Mr. Percy Peck, was now becoming increasingly more convinced that his brother-in-law had had something to do with the deaths of his parents, and was now becoming concerned for the safety of his sister. He enlisted the help of a private investigator, a gentleman named Mr. Raymond Schindler. Mr. Schindler looked into Arthur's business and his supposed dentistry credentials. Strangely, he was unable to find very much at all about Dr. Arthur Waite. He could not locate his dental surgery. In fact, there wasn't even a New York dentistry license registered in his name. What the investigator did discover, though, was that Arthur knew a lot of people and was considered a social butterfly and an admirer of showgirls. Raymond managed to get the supervisor of Arthur and Clara's apartment block to let him and his team into the apartments to investigate further. While searching the apartments, they found some very interesting items. In a safe was a large amount of cash, possibly the money that Clara's Aunt Catherine had asked Arthur to invest for her. Arsenic was bookmarked in a pharmacology book, and there were glass slides of typhoid specimens in his office. They found out that he had been conducting private studies at Cornwall Medical School, even though he wasn't formally enrolled. He had told the professors that he had wished to study this in order that one day he may be able to prevent people dying from the diseases caused by these bacteria. Investigators also discovered that he had a room at the Plaza Hotel, which had been registered under the name Dr. and Mrs. Margaret Walters. Mrs. Margaret Walters was really a married lady named Margaret Hornton, who worked as a cabaret singer. Although they had taken a suite at the hotel, Mrs. Hornton would later insist that their relationship was purely platonic. With all the evidence pointing at Arthur having something to do with the deaths of his in-laws, the police took him in for questioning. They asked him if he had purchased arsenic, which Arthur denied, and he said that he would never hurt anyone. The police reminded him of a conversation that he had had with Clara's Aunt Catherine just a week after Mr. John Peck's death. Apparently he had called her and asked, "What do you think a man should do if he was cornered? Would you consider suicide?" Arthur denied all the accusations the police put to him, and following the questioning, he was released and returned to his Riverside Drive apartment. At about the same time, the results of the autopsy on Mr. John Peck's stomach were released and confirmed that he had been poisoned. Now, with all the evidence from the autopsy, the police went to arrest Mr. Arthur Waite. However, when they arrived at his apartment, they discovered that he was in a very bad way. He was in a coma as a result of taking an overdose of sleeping tablets. He was taken to hospital, where doctors pumped his stomach and managed to return him to consciousness. Upon his recovery, he was immediately arrested. Arthur denied that he had poisoned his father-in-law, but the police were continuing to gather evidence. They discovered that he had purchased arsenic from a local doctor. They also uncovered that Arthur had paid the undertaker who had embalmed Mr. Peck to do so using fluid containing arsenic. This method had been used in the 19th century but was now prohibited. Arthur had paid quite a lot of money for him to do this, and although the undertaker was happy to accept the payments, he did not actually put any arsenic in the embalming fluid. The police considered that they had enough evidence and charged Arthur Warren Waite with the murder of his father-in-law, Mr. John Peck. The trial began in April 1916, and Arthur pleaded not guilty, even though he had written to a New York newspaper confessing to the crimes. It was also revealed that the mysterious Miss Kay Adams, who had sent the telegram to Percy following the death of his father, was actually Mrs. Elizabeth Hardwick, the sister of Dr. Cornell, who was in charge of the Cornell Medical School, where Arthur seemed to spend so much time. She had become very suspicious of him following the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Peck, and wondered why he had such a fascination for lethal bacterias. Mrs. Margaret Horton told the court that Arthur had actually taken her to the Cornell laboratory and showed her different deadly bacterias. By this time, Mr. and Mrs. Peck had both died, and when Mrs. Horton asked him if he had been responsible for their deaths, he replied that indeed he was. Arthur took to the stand in his own defence and told a strange tale of how the spirit of an evil Egyptian priest had entered his body and then instructed him to kill his in-laws in order to gain their wealth. It was believed he did this in the hope that the jury would find him insane. However, he had been examined by psychiatrists before the trial, and they all agreed that he was in fact sane. The jury did not fall for his tall tale, and in May 1916, Mr. Arthur Warren Waite was found guilty of the murder of Mr. John Peck and sentenced to death by the electric chair. While awaiting his execution at Sing Sing prison, Arthur omitted the methods he used to successfully poison his mother-in-law, Mrs. Hannah Peck, and his father-in-law, Mr. John Peck. He said that Mrs. Peck had died relatively quickly. He had started to mix things in her food on the day she arrived. The assortment of germs he used included diphtheria and influenza. On the evening of the 29th of January 1916, he gave her Veronal tablets, and when he checked on her again in the early hours of the following day, he realised that she was dead. He said that he returned to bed as he thought it best that Clara discover that her mother had passed away during the night. It had been, however, far more difficult to kill his father-in-law. He tried diphtheria, tuberculosis, typhus and influenza, but this did not have the desired effect, so in the end he smothered him with a rag covered in chloroform. Arthur Warren Waite was executed in the electric chair on the 24th of May 1917. After Arthur's death, an autopsy was performed. During this, two very interesting facts were discovered. One was a scar, which was caused as he had suffered from meningitis as a child, and doctors believed that this may have partially accounted for his psychopathic disposition. The other was something that would not normally be associated with a murderer, which was a very large heart. Arthur's wife Clara married again and had a daughter who she named Louise. Clara died in Seattle in 1964, aged 76. The fourth case was recorded in 2023 and took place in the USA in the second part of the 19th century. George Crozier was born in 1833 in the small town of Benton in the northern part of Yates County in the Finger Lakes region of the state of New York. His grandfather had emigrated from Scotland in 1801, and young George was brought up in a strict religious family, along with his elder brother named David. The family were respected and industrious people, and George himself was considered to be a person of integrity and moral rectitude. In 1855, George married Miss Fanny Becker, a charming 19-year-old who had been adopted and brought up by her uncle. Following the wedding, they continued to live in Benton and were seen as a dignified and virtuous couple. On the 6th of January 1857, Fanny gave birth to their only child, a boy who they named Frank. Life went on for the Crozier family, and the following years saw many changes in the United States. After the Civil War, the country started to transform into an industrial urbanized nation. There was much technological innovation. The railway network was expanding, the economy grew, and agricultural production increased. But at the same time, there were social tensions brought about by the increasing demands of life in the latter part of the 19th century. George had become quite friendly with a young lady named Minerva Dutcher. She came from a large family of which she was the oldest child. She went to the local school, attended church, and sang in the choir. All the pursuits that were expected of a young lady in the 1870s. However, by 1872, people were starting to comment about why Mr. George Crozier, a gentleman of nearly 40 years of age, was spending so much time in the company of Miss Minerva Dutcher. He had been seen out on a number of occasions walking past her house, and when she came out, the pair would then walk off together. He had also been seen near her school, and she would leave the classroom to speak to him. He would also pass her little messages that he had previously written, and of course, he would see her in church. Between 1872 and 1875, it seemed that everyone in Benton was aware that Mr. Crozier was infatuated by Miss Dutcher, and it appeared that she reciprocated his feelings. On the 15th of July 1875, Mrs. Fanny Crozier, a lady who had previously experienced very good health, was unexpectedly taken ill. She had very bad stomach pains, but attributed this to eating cucumbers. She took to her bed, and although she felt unwell, over the next few days she started to feel a little better. During this time, she was regularly attended by her husband. However, on the 27th of July, she again started to feel ill. A friend named Miss Sarah Towner was passing the house and saw Mr. Crozier sitting in his porch. She asked him if Mrs. Crozier was home, and he said that she was, but she was feeling unwell and had taken to her bed. Mrs. Towner went to the bedroom and saw that Fanny seemed to be in great distress. She was vomiting and complaining that she had horrible pains in her stomach. Mrs. Towner asked Mr. Crozier why he had not asked a doctor to attend his wife, but Mr. Crozier just shrugged his shoulders and replied that a doctor had already seen her and given her powders of subnitrate of bismuth, which Mr. Crozier said he had prepared for his wife to take as a doctor prescribed. He thought that calling him back would be of no use. Mrs. Towner decided to go and speak to Dr. Barber herself. She explained to him that her friend Mrs. Crozier was not at all well, and Dr. Barber then agreed to go and see her again that evening. He arrived at around 9 o'clock and found that Mrs. Crozier's condition had not improved. She was suffering from a swollen stomach, a dry throat, and a rapid pulse. Dr. Barber prepared some different medicine and explained to Mr. Crozier exactly how it should be administered. He said that he would return the following morning to check on the patient. The next morning, Mrs. Crozier was no better, and doctor told her to keep taking the medicine. The following day, Thursday the 29th of July, Mr. and Mrs. Crozier's son named Frank arrived at Dr. Barber's house very early and informed him that his mother was in a particularly bad way. Dr. Barber immediately went to the Croziers' property. By now it was 6 a.m. and Mrs. Crozier was unable to speak and her pupils had contracted. Dr. James Allen also came to assist. He suggested that she may be more comfortable if they moved her to the parlour, but shortly after, Mrs. Fanny Crozier died. Mr. Crozier told Dr. Barber that he did not want any examination of his wife and was concerned as he was aware that another lady who had died a few years earlier had been cut up. He wanted to be able to bury his wife and have time for him and his son to grieve. 2 days later, on Saturday the 31st of July 1875, the funeral took place of Mrs. Fanny Crozier. Most of the town turned out to pay their respects to a charming lady who had been a popular member of the local community. She was only 37 years old. A week after the tragic death of the wife of Mr. George Crozier, his son Frank was married to a young lady named Miss Emma Armstrong. Frank thought that his father needed support, so he and his wife went to live with him. However, at the end of August, Miss Minerva Dutcher also moved into the Crozier residence. Apparently, George had hired her to work as his housekeeper. Emma told him that she would take care of the house and that Frank would help out, so there was no need for him to hire Miss Dutcher. Mr. Crozier, however, informed her that the young lady's trunk had already arrived at the house, and there wasn't any use in talking any more about it. Mr. Crozier had been seen to pass notes in church to Minerva just a few days after his wife had died. He had also been seen meeting her at the graveyard where his wife was buried and walking with her towards her house. Rumours of some sort of improper relationship between Mr. Crozier and Miss Dutcher had been circling around Benton for a long time, long before Mrs. Crozier had died, but now there was speculation that the cause of Mrs. Fanny Crozier's demise may have been due to something quite sinister. Some of Mrs. Crozier's friends had long since suspected that there had been more to her death than a sudden illness, and in October 1875, 3 months after she died, the coroner ordered that her body should be exhumed and that the contents of her stomach and liver examined. Dr. Frank Tompkins, along with Dr. James Waddell and Dr. Barber, were instructed to go to the grave of Mrs. Crozier in order to remove vital organs that could then be analysed. They intended to remove the stomach, but the body was very much decomposed, and instead they extracted the lungs and hearts. When they realised their mistake, they returned to the grave and removed the deceased's stomach and a portion of her liver. These were then put in jars and sent to Professor John Towler, who was a professor of chemistry and toxicology at the Medical College of Geneva in New York. Professor Towler found that there were quite significant traces of arsenic in the stomach of Mrs. Crozier, and this had undoubtedly caused her death. Mr. George Crozier was then arrested and charged with murder. The small town of Benton was shocked that such an upstanding citizen as Mr. George Crozier would be arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. He claimed he was innocent, and many residents believed him to be so. His trial began on the 6th of March 1876 in the courthouse in Penn Yan, an incorporated village in Yates County in the state of New York. Mr. Crozier pleaded not guilty. The prosecution outlined the facts of the case. They claimed that the 42-year-old defendant had poisoned his wife, 37-year-old Mrs. Fanny Crozier, as he wanted to be with Miss Minerva Dutcher, an 18-year-old young lady with whom he was very much infatuated. Many witnesses were called to help the prosecution prove their case. Miss Sarah Towner told of how she had been present when Mrs. Crozier died. Mr. Robert Paul informed the court of how he was in charge of the cemetery and was present when Mrs. Crozier's body was exhumed, so toxicology tests could be performed. Dr. Tompkins, Waddell, Barber, Allen and Stevens, as well as Professor Towler, all gave evidence. Dr. Barber described the remedies he had made up for Mrs. Crozier during her period of illness, and Professor Towler told of how he had tested for the presence of poisons in Mrs. Crozier's body and how he discovered that there was evidence of arsenic. Other witnesses spoke of how Mr. Crozier would spend as much time as possible in the company of Miss Dutcher. Minnie Truesdell told the court that Miss Minerva Dutcher had worked in the house of her parents. She said that Mr. Crozier would often visit and that Miss Dutcher would go outside through the back door in the kitchen and talk to him. She said that this happened quite regularly. Minnie Truesdell's brother Charles confirmed his sister's story. Witnesses testified to have seen George Crozier passing notes to Miss Dutcher in the church, and all witnesses believed that despite their age difference, they had always seemed very fond of each other. A gentleman named Mr. David Armstrong told of how he had seen the defendant and Miss Dutcher together on many occasions. He said that he first noticed that they seemed very friendly in 1872. He saw them walking to and from church together. He added that Mr. Crozier regularly distributed the Sunday school paper in church and usually ended up by giving the last paper to Minerva and would then sit next to her. He also told of the time the defendant and his wife were at a picnic at Crosby's Woods, and when the picnic ended, Mrs. Crozier was packing up when Mr. Crozier came over to her, and Mrs. Crozier then said, "George, you have been playing around with the girls all day. Now come and help me pack the things." To which Mr. Crozier replied, "Shut up, or I will jab you right down your throat." Mr. Armstrong said that Mr. Crozier had a roll of jelly cake in his hand, and when speaking to his wife, raised his voice somewhat and appeared excited. Although no one had actually seen Mr. George Crozier poison his wife, the prosecution had produced many witnesses that had seen him on many occasions with Miss Dutcher, and it seemed apparent that he was very fond of the young lady. There was indeed a motive for him wanting to be rid of his wife. The defence, however, presented a very different case. They told the court that any evidence against the defendant was circumstantial and that all the evidence presented by the prosecution was weak and unreliable. They did not suggest that the cause of death of Mrs. Fanny Crozier was not arsenic poisoning, but they told the court that the arsenic was not administered by the defendant. They said that when Mrs. Fanny Crozier became ill, Mr. Crozier asked Dr. Barber to attend her. Dr. Barber had had already said that he had prescribed Mrs. Crozier with powders of subnitrate of bismuth, Dr. Charles Woodward now stood in the witness box and informed the jury that medical books caution using this as it contains arsenic. Dr. Henry Nichols then gave the court a detailed report about arsenic poisoning. He said that it was an irritant poison and acts pretty directly on the nervous system. If Dr. Barber had prescribed a too large a dose of powders of subnitrate of bismuth, it was possible that Mrs. Crozier could have died as a result. The defence also claimed that Mrs. Crozier believed that she was dying of stomach cancer, and as she did not want to suffer, had decided to take her own life. A gentleman named Mr. Martin Barden said that Mrs. Crozier had told him that she was sick with stomach cancer, so would take something before she was too ill to do so. Mrs. Crozier's son Frank also gave evidence. He said that his mother had told him that if she was ill with stomach cancer, she would make way with herself. Frank then said that he told her that she should not think to do such a thing, because if she did, blame would be laid on either himself or his father. Frank went on to say that his mother told him that this would not be so, and that no one would ever know what she had done. He also said that his mother had asked him to purchase arsenic to kill rats, but he had forgotten, so instead his father purchased it. However, other witnesses, such as Mr. Crozier's sister-in-law, Mrs. Dolly Crozier, told the court that the deceased had never mentioned anything about suffering from stomach cancer to her. The defence reminded the jury that on the day of Mrs. Crozier's death, Mr. Crozier had sent for Dr. Allen, a very respectable and capable doctor, even though Dr. Barber was attending Mrs. Crozier. They claimed he did this as he was very worried about her and wanted another medical opinion. The defence stressed that this was not the actions of a man who had the intention of ridding himself of his wife. It was the testimony of Mr. Crozier's daughter-in-law, Mrs. Emma Crozier, that was the most controversial. She told the court that following Mrs. Crozier's death, her father-in-law, Mr. George Crozier, had told her that there had been arsenic in their pantry, which they had kept for the purpose of killing rats. But a few days after his wife's passing, Mr. Crozier had discovered that the arsenic had gone. Mrs. Emma Crozier said that her father-in-law had told her that he feared that Fanny may have taken it, as she believed that she was suffering from stomach cancer, and had said that if she was, she would put herself out of the way. However, Mrs. Emma Crozier's most damning testimony was still to come. She said that following her father-in-law's arrest, she visited him in jail. He asked her if his wife, Mrs. Fanny Crozier, had ever told her that she would take arsenic if it was found that she was suffering from cancer of the stomach, to which Miss Emma Crozier said that she replied that she had not. Mr. Crozier then asked if she would say that his wife had indeed said that to her, to which she replied that she would only tell the truth. Miss Crozier continued. She said that Mr. Crozier had then asked if she would swear to it that his wife had said that, and said that if she would, he would make sure that she did not want for anything. However, Mrs. Emma Crozier told the court that her reply was the same, that she would only speak the truth. When the trial ended, the judge spent some time summing up the case before the jury was sent out to consider the verdict. They returned 2 hours later to find the defendant, Mr. George Crozier, guilty of murder. When asked if he had anything to say, Mr. Crozier said in a calm voice, "Your Honour, I stand before you, and I expect to stand before my Heavenly Father to answer for what I have done here. I claim my innocence. I claim that the testimony given by Emma Crozier, my daughter-in-law, against me is utterly false. I stand before God and before these witnesses and protest my innocence." The judge then sentenced him to death. The verdict was appealed and a retrial sought, but both were denied. However, his execution date was changed from the 3rd of May to the 16th of June. This gave sufficient time for a petition asking for the sentence to be commuted to be presented to the state governor. Eventually, it was agreed that the sentence would be changed to life in prison, but on the condition that the defence accept the guilty verdict and did not campaign for a second trial. Mr. George E. Crozier was then sent to serve his punishment at the state prison in Auburn, and this is where he died 20 years later in 1896. Throughout his time in prison, he always maintained that he was innocent and that he had not poisoned his wife. Following Mr. Crozier's conviction, Minerva Dutcher continued to live in Benton. She married a gentleman named John Calhoun and went on to have 5 children. She died in the nearby village of Penyan in October 1915. She was 58 years old. Hello everyone, thanks for making it to the end of this video, and once again thanks for all your support during 2024. Please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I hope to see you all again next week for the next Brief Case